I never thought the ghosts of my past would appear at my door, but they did, shivering in the chilly night air and clothed in ancient clothes. My parents, who had previously regarded me with contemptuous dismay, suddenly stood in front of me, their faces etched with desperation. I remained motionless and silent. This time, I wasn't the one pleading, but the weight of their betrayal weighed on me like a well-known agony. My mother's lips quivered as she uttered my name. "Scarlett, please. We have nowhere else to go." I remained silent for a while, allowing the silence to grow, allowing them to sense it. Our last conversation, if you can call it that, took place in a slick legal office nearly 5 years ago, at which time my entire world had been torn apart in a matter of minutes. I had just graduated from law school at the age of 23 when my grandfather died. The one person who had ever genuinely believed in me, he had been my staunchest ally. As my parents devoted their entire lives to supporting my older sister, Vivian, and praising her alleged entrepreneurial spirit, Grandpa had noticed something in me that they had never noticed in me. "Success isn't about making noise, Scarlett," he would remark as he moved his bishop steadily across the board during our monthly chess games. "It's about making the smartest moves." He had covered my tuition for law school, supported me when my parents disregarded me, and assured me that I would one day have the security they never provided. He ought to have had a straightforward will. He had always made it clear that Vivian and I would each receive $2 million from his estate, which would be divided equally between us. However, the words didn't make sense to me as I listened to the lawyer read the will in that chilly room with wood paneling. With his glasses adjusted, the attorney declared, "The entire $4 million estate will be transferred to Vivian Carter for her business ventures, as per the recent amendment." My throat tightened each breath. With my voice hardly audible above a whisper, I repeated, "Amendment?" My parents wouldn't look into my eyes. Vivian, however, made no effort to conceal her grin. Rather than stab me in the back, my mother had reached for my hand and whispered, "Oh, Scarlett, Vivian's new tech startup needs capital. You have your law degree? You'll be fine. She needs this more than you do." I had the impression that I was not in my own body. I choked out, "You convinced Grandpa to change his will," in a hollow, distant voice. When my father did speak, it was with the same haughty haughtiness I had learned to dislike. "It was the right thing to do, Scarlett. Your sister has real vision. This money will help her create something meaningful. You're just going to work for someone else anyway." With my world crashing around me and my hands shaking, I stormed out of that office that day. Later, Grandpa's business colleague told me the whole thing. My parents had visited him in his last days, when he was barely conscious from his medicine, and they had persuaded him to sign what they called routine documents. I had been robbed. Trying to remember how to breathe, I sat in my small apartment that night, surrounded by student loan bills, and stared at my hands. At that point, I promised something. I wouldn't require them ever again. Brick by brick, case by case, I would construct something tangible. And I would remember this moment when they eventually made a comeback. Because people like them usually do. And now, finally, that day had come. Standing outside my home, which I had purchased on my own, without a single dime of what should have been my inheritance, I gazed at them. They had been decimated for 5 years. My father's shoulders were hunched, and his hair had turned grayer. My mother's pricey jewelry was gone. It was probably sold to raise money. Vivian had spent all of her money. Her tech company didn't succeed. Her healthy juice bar comes next. Then a scam with cryptocurrency. Ultimately, my parents' retirement funds were taken with her when her opulent pet spa business collapsed tragically. In order to finance her extravagant fantasies, they had even taken out a last mortgage on their house. And now, the bank was foreclosing. Again, my mother begged, "Just until we get back on our feet," her voice cracking. "We're still your parents, Scarlett." My fingers gripped the doorframe tighter as I cocked my head slightly. Despite everything, I had extended an olive branch to them the last time they visited my house, which was 3 months earlier. I had shown them the life I had created without them and invited them around for dinner. Unimpressed, my father had surveyed the area. "Well, it's nice, small, but nice. Nothing like what Vivian's place used to be." Never one to pass up an opportunity to add a twist, my mother had also added, "At least you're saving money, living alone. No family to support, just yourself." I had invited them to dinner. but they had refused, said that they needed to deal with a business emergency, that crisis. Selecting exquisite Italian marble for the reception area of Vivian's pet spa. The foolishness of it. I could almost chuckle now that they were there in front of me, their confidence broken, their haughtiness stripped away. I let out a deep breath and turned to face Emily, my housekeeper, who was standing directly behind me. She whispered, "Should I call security?" I continued to look at them. A slow, icy smile then appeared on my lips. I whispered, "No, Emily," and returned to the comfort of my house. Let them stay. My heels clicked lightly on the wooden floor as I turned and headed toward my office. They're about to learn a valuable lesson about consequences. I shut the door behind me, keeping them out and the cold out. However, I could still hear their voices in my mind. "We're still your parents, Scarlett," as if there was any meaning left in that title. As if 5 years of hardship, 5 years of silence, and 5 years of seeing them discard everything on Vivian's failed endeavors, while I fought my way up from nothing, could be undone by blood alone. I steadied myself by taking a slow breath. I was no longer the defenseless young woman sitting in a lawyer's office, witnessing the theft of my future. Right now, I was in charge. My office was poorly lighted, with long shadows created by my laptop's backlight. Before I opened a folder I had been holding on to for months, I sat at my desk with my fingers lingering over the trackpad. Financial records of Vivian Carter. The first opened it by clicking. The chaos, the devastation, the proof of my family's demise, there it was. In just 18 months, Vivian had spent $3.5 million. I felt sick to my stomach from the breakdown. A branding consultant who did nothing was paid $50,000. The workplace ambiance design, expensive furnishings, and mood lighting cost $75. $100,000 for an influencer campaign featuring a celebrity pet. Wasted all that money. And I had been working 16-hour shifts, eating ramen, and paying off student loans that should have been covered by my inheritance at night while she lived in penthouse apartments and sipped champagne at networking parties. I made myself maintain my composure by clenching my jaw. It buzzed on my phone. I already knew the name, so I didn't even need to look it up. Vivian. My screen displayed her message, "You have to help them. They lost everything because of me." Now, at least, she was acknowledging it. But when the following text message arrived, I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "Maybe you could give them some of your money? You're doing so well now." The boldness. I reflected on the day, only 3 months ago, that I closed on this house, my home. Despite everything, I had given my parents a final opportunity to be involved in my life by inviting them over. They had entered the space with a faint sense of disappointment. Dad had responded, "Well, it's nice, small, but nice," looking about as if he were checking out a poor hotel suite. In the same patronizing manner, Mom had also said, "At least you're saving money, living alone. No family to support, just yourself." I had not seen them again after that. They were now pleading at my door. I was startled out of my reverie by a knock on my office door. My housekeeper, Emily, appeared uncertain as she stepped in. "Miss Carter?" she replied cautiously. "Should I call security? They're still outside." I got up and moved toward the window. Neither of my parents had moved. Dad was hooked to his phone, most likely in an attempt to get in touch with Vivian. With her dramatic flair intact, Mom sat on the front steps and used a tissue to dab at her eyes. A few neighbors had assembled to witness the event. I turned back to Emily after taking a slow drink of my coffee. "No, let them stay," I answered calmly as I put down my cup. "They're about to learn a lesson in consequences." I took out my phone and called first. "My personal detective," I inquired. "Is everything ready?" "It's all in place," he replied. "The forged amendment to the will, the bank transfers, the recordings of your parents admitting what they did, everything." I let out a breath and briefly closed my eyes. "Good. Send me everything." Marcus, the firm's top criminal defense lawyer, received the next call. "Marcus, is everything filed?" "Yes." "We can move whenever you're ready," I thought as I drummed my fingers on my desk. One final call. I paused before making the call. But this was the most important. Uncle James, the younger brother of my grandfather, the only relative who had initially trusted me. His powerful voice thundered across the line. Scarlett, is it time? I took a swallow. Yeah, Uncle James, it's time. He had been collecting evidence, silently observing, and waiting for the past 5 years, because he never once thought my grandfather would have abandoned me. We had constructed an impenetrable case together. It was time to put it to use. I adjusted my blazer's cuffs and straightened my stance. It's time to confront them. I approached the front door and cautiously opened it. Dad instantly leaped to his feet. His face lit up with relief. Finally! Scarlett, be reasonable. We're freezing out here. Mom sobbed, softly and brokenly. How can you treat your own parents this way? I cocked my head, observing them intently. Then I grinned. Not the kind that is gentle and forgiving. No. 5 years prior, when she was sitting in that lawyer's office, knowing she had won, Vivian had worn the same smug, triumphant smile. You're right, I responded with ease as I moved to the side. We should talk. Come in. Their gazes darted around, taking in the elegant leather furnishings and the enormous fireplace that crackled softly as they hurried past me and into the cozy living room of my house. I didn't miss the irony. Now they appeared so tiny. There was nothing like the menacing people who had once grasped my future and thoughtlessly destroyed it. With my legs crossed, I sat across from them and observed how their faces alternated between anxiety and hope. I put my hands on my lap and said, There's something you should know before we discuss your housing situation. Leaning forward, I spoke in a soothing, somewhat conversational tone. Uncle James and I had a very interesting meeting with the district attorney last week. Dad's face lost its color. Mom froze in mid-dab, her tissue frozen. Between us, there was stillness. I laid out the papers from the big folder on the coffee table. Police reports, bank records, records from the hospital during Grandpa's last days. Moreover, the most damning? The initial will. Dad groped for a piece of paper, his hands shaking. His voice was shaking as he questioned, Where did you get these? I let out a slow breath while looking him in the eye. I'm a lawyer, Dad. Finding evidence is what I do. I selected a single document and slid it in their direction. This is a nursing log from Grandpa's last week. Interesting notes about your visits, especially on the day he supposedly changed his will. Patient heavily sedated, barely conscious. Mom started crying. This time, real ones. She cried and said, We were just trying to help Vivian. I spoke steadily. By committing fraud? Dad started to say something, but I interrupted him. Oh, I understand perfectly. Let me show you exactly what I understand. I took out my laptop and started clicking through a prepared presentation. I presented the hard, icy numbers slide by slide. $200,000 for a Bali business retreat. $150,000 for high-end workplace furnishings. $1,000 for five-star resort team building. Additionally, I had been working 16-hour hours, living on $30 per day, and drowning in debt as Vivian burned through stolen money. The doorbell rang. Uncle James entered after Emily opened it. Mom turned pale. Dad tensed. James, Mom said in a tremulous voice, what are you doing here? Uncle James stood taller than them, his arms folded. He said, supporting my niece, like I should have done 5 years ago. Uncle James took the armchair next to me while my parents sat motionless, their bodies tense. Seeing them in this state small, helpless, and confined was odd. The same individuals who had thoughtlessly stolen my future and treated me like an afterthought all of my life were now staring at me as though I had control over their destiny. Since I did, in an attempt to recover some of the power he once had over me, Dad cleared his throat and forced himself to sit up straighter. Scarlett, let's be reasonable. This is unnecessary. You've done well for yourself. We're just asking for a little help. It nearly made me chuckle. Reasonable? 5 years ago, when they had seen me leave that legal office broke, betrayed, and bankrupt, where was this rationality? When they were standing next to Vivian, complimenting her vision while I was struggling to make ends meet while drowning in debt, where was this fairness? I folded my arms and leaned back. You stole my inheritance, left me to struggle, and now you expect me to just forget all that because you're struggling for the first time in your lives? Mom's lip trembled as tears filled her eyes. We're your parents, Scarlett. Please, we had no choice. I shook my head and scoffed. You did have a choice, and you chose Vivian. Every time. You always chose her. We were separated by a dense, oppressive silence. Uncle James then spoke, his booming voice like a dagger slicing through the tension. His eyes were stern and cruel as he replied, I watched you two cover up what you did for 5 years. And I'll admit, I should have stepped in sooner. I should have fought harder for Scarlett back then. But I'm here now, and you're finally going to face the consequences of what you did. Dad's mouth tightened. He detested being the one on the defensive and detested being talked down to. At last, he bit out, What do you want from us? I tapped a legal document twice with my finger before sliding it across the coffee table. I stated, This is a settlement offer. You're going to sign a confession admitting to what you did, the forgery, the theft, the manipulation. You're also going to agree to pay back every cent of the $2 million you stole from me. Mom's fingers flew to her chest as she gasped, We don't have that kind of money. Dad's barely controlled anger turned his face hot. He said, That money's gone. I cocked my head. Then sell your house. I felt a terrible sense of delight when their features crumbled. I added, Oh, wait, in a mock sympathetic tone. You can't sell your house, can you? Because you mortgaged it to fund Vivian's pet spa empire, and now the bank is taking it. Mom shook her head in shock and let out a broken sob. With a whisper, she asked, You would send your own parents to jail? Without flinching, I looked her in the eye. I told them bluntly, You stole from your own daughter, which is worse. The ensuing quiet was oppressive and oppressive. My phone then buzzed. The time was ideal. I looked at the display. Vivian. I put her on speaker and grinned. Mom and Dad say you're threatening them with jail. How could you do this to them? To us? She said sharply, her voice echoing around the room. I crossed my arms and leaned back. I said in a sarcastic tone, After everything they've done for us? Over the phone, there was a sneer. They did it for the family, Scarlett. They believed in my dreams. They supported my vision. You wouldn't even be where you are now if they hadn't freed you up to focus on your law career instead of wasting your time on a business. I gave a harsh chuckle. You think what they did was freeing me up, I responded. I worked 16-hour shifts while you burned through millions of dollars on Italian marble floors for a pet spa. I paid off student loans that were supposed to be covered by my inheritance. You think I should be grateful? Vivian paused. I sensed doubt in her voice for the first time in years. At last, she said, Scarlett, what do you want? I didn't think twice. I want what's mine. When I hung up, the living room fell silent. Mom wiped her face, attempting to gather her thoughts. As if they were a death sentence, Dad sat there and stared at the settlement papers. At last, Uncle James got up and set a pen on the table after taking it out of his pocket. Sign it, was all he said. Like a guy who realizes the walls are closing in on him, Dad exhaled a long, tired sigh. Then he grabbed for the pen gently. Dad's fingers shook, as though the ink itself weighed 1,000 pounds as the pen hovered over the settlement documents. Mom sat still next to him, her face pinched and pale, her well-trimmed nails now clutching the table's edge, as if she were going to be pulled under. It was this, the reckoning moment. Dad took a strong breath through his nose and clenched his jaw. Reality was losing the war against his pride. He was aware that he had no other option, but the fact that he was being made to sign his own confession and declare that they had lost all they had bet on, Vivian was killing him. This is ridiculous, he said in a low, resentful voice. Scarlett, you already have a successful career. What more do you want? Revenge? I rested my elbows on my knees and leaned forward. Simply put, I want justice, I said. He gave a feeble sneer. His fingers clenched around the pen as his shoulders slumped. Without glancing at me, he whispered, You're just like him. I froze. Who? His eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite identify when he finally looked up. He said, Your grandfather, with a harsh tone, always playing the long game, always waiting to strike at just the right moment. You think this is about fairness? No, Scarlett, this is about power. And right now, you have it. I looked at him for a while. For the first time in my life, he recognized me as an equal to him. Not as a bother, not as Vivian's trailing shadow. However, as someone who had outperformed him. You're right, I answered, cocking my head to the side. I do have the power now. And you only have one way out of this. I gave the papers a tap. Sign. There was a faint ticking of the clock in the background. Mom covered her mouth with one shaky palm and sniffed. After letting out a breath through his nostrils, Dad eventually put the pen down on the page and signed his name. Something settled inside of me as soon as the ink dried. It was finished. I no longer had to endure the burden of the unfairness, the rage, and the treachery that I had held for 5 years. It was theirs now. After putting the papers back in the folder, I stood up and straightened my blazer. I answered with ease, "I'll have my lawyer finalize everything. In the meantime, you'll need to start liquidating whatever assets you have left. The house, the cars, whatever's not tied up in debt." Mom sobbed quietly and choked. Dad merely gazed at the table. They were at a loss for words for the first time in my life. I stepped to the door with Uncle James. He had mostly kept quiet, allowing me to speak first. However, he eventually said as we entered the corridor, "He wasn't wrong, you know." I raised an eyebrow as I turned to face him. "About what?" Uncle James smiled at me knowingly. "You are just like your grandfather." With my lips gently curling, I exhaled slowly. Good. Because the only person who had ever put faith in me was Grandpa. He had been correct. In the days that followed, I saw everything play out just as I had anticipated. It was a formal settlement. In an effort to get rid of whatever they could, my parents put their house up for sale. Once so self-assured and untouchable, Vivian had become quiet. Her spouse abandoned her. Her reputation in business was in tatters. She had lost the friends who used to flock to her when she was wealthy and powerful. It's funny how that worked. Finally, toward the end of the week, she made contact. Not with apologies, not with regret, but with a final, fervent request. "Scarlett, we have nowhere to go. Please. I know I don't deserve your help, but Mom and Dad, they won't survive this. They have nothing. We have nothing." The message was read twice by me. After that, I decided what to do. I spent a lot of time looking at Vivian's message. "Scarlett, we have nowhere to go. Please. I know I don't deserve your help, but Mom and Dad, they won't survive this. They have nothing. We have nothing. Nothing." When that word eventually applies to someone, it's funny how soon they realize how serious it is. I put my phone down and inhaled deeply. The rational side of me anticipated this. It was easy to predict Vivian. My parents were predictable. They had lived their entire lives evading punishment because they thought someone would always catch them before they could fall. They had no idea that I would be the one witnessing their downfall this time. Uncle James watched me intently as he leaned against the kitchen counter. He questioned, "What are you going to do?" I took a while to respond. As an alternative, I went to my office, opened a drawer, and took out 3 plain envelopes. I ran my thumb along the sealed edges while I held them. I then made my way back to the front entrance and bided my time. Since I was aware, I anticipated their arrival. It took very little time. There was a knock on the door that night. When the sky grew deep blue and purple, I opened it gradually. And there they were, the 3 of them. Vivian, Dad. They had a different appearance. The haughtiness had vanished. The weight of their own decisions had caused the entitlement and superiority to shatter. Something straightforward and useful had taken the place of Vivian's pricey designer coat. Her features, which had before exuded confidence, suddenly appeared hollow. Mom's eyes were red-rimmed, and her once perfectly groomed hair appeared limp and lifeless. Dad, who used to dominate my life with a condescending demeanor and words of contempt, remained quiet, shoulders drooped. A man who had lost everything. "Scarlett," Mom said, her voice breaking. "We have nowhere else to go." Vivian's lips quivered as she swallowed forcefully. "Please." The burden of the past weighed heavily on me as I stared at them for a long time. The evenings I worked as they celebrated Vivian's next big idea. The money I paid off, the food I didn't eat, and the fatigue that held on to me as they prospered off of stolen goods. The shame, the quiet. Then Grandpa came to mind. What he'd have desired. Not for them. For me. I took a deep breath and dug into my coat pocket. I presented the envelopes to them. Mom opened hers first, her fingers trembling as she did so. Her breath caught. There was a bus ticket inside. One way. To Florida. And enough money to pay for a small flat for 3 months. Vivian opened her hands, which were shaking. She made a broken, low sound. "You're sending us away?" I looked directly into her eyes, my face unreadable. Calmly, I responded, I'm giving you what you gave me. A chance to survive. Nothing more. When Dad did speak, it was in a raspy voice. Scarlett, thank you. I raised a hand. I said, don't take this as forgiveness, in a steady voice. This isn't me welcoming you back into my life. This is a transaction. You pay back every cent you stole, and maybe one day we'll talk about family. Until then, I took a step back. We're just strangers tied by bad choices and blood. Vivian nodded despite her lip quivering. Mom clutched Dad's arm as she wiped away her tears. They turned slowly, and I saw them go, their bodies burdened, not by their belongings, but by the repercussions they had avoided throughout their lives. Vivian had traded in her expensive designer handbag for a cheap nylon backpack. Mom's dazzling jewelry was auctioned to pay for her legal bills. Even Dad's once assured gait had changed to a smaller, more tentative one. It was finished. I felt light for the first time in years. Not bare, not resentful, simply put, free. The only item of Grandpa's that I had retained was his old leather chair, which I sat in that evening. With one hand holding a glass of wine and the other resting on the shabby armrest, I traced the familiar indentations with my fingertips. I took it all in while I closed my eyes. The quiet, the tranquility. It felt like mine for the first time in years. Whispering to the night, I slightly raised the glass. Checkmate, Grandpa. And I took a sip of the life I had created for myself.